The wind howled across the desolate wasteland of Thera, ripping at Jake Morgan's clothing and sinking deep into his skin. He could feel the bitter cold of the planet creeping into his bones, even through his thermal suit. Above him, the red dwarf star bathed the landscape in a dark blood-red light, casting long shadows over the snowy expanse. This was a place where even the most courageous explorers could disappear without a trace, leaving nothing behind but frozen remnants of their existence. Jake's mission had been straightforward: deliver cargo to the research outpost. But a series of malfunctions, a crash landing, and a broken distress beacon had turned his journey into a nightmare. For 3 weeks, he had scavenged whatever scraps he could find, desperately hoping for a signal, praying that someone, anyone, would come to his rescue. The hours turned into days, and the days bled into each other. There seemed to be no end in sight. Alone, so terribly alone. That is, until something caught his attention, a flicker in the endless white, a movement, something or someone alive. His instincts flared, every part of him screamed to remain cautious. Dropping into a defensive crouch, his hand immediately went to the plasma pistol at his side. Who or what could be out here in this forsaken wasteland? The settlement should have been abandoned, but the figure approaching was unmistakable. A woman, her skin faintly glowing in the crimson light, stood against the storm, clutching a small bundle to her chest. The wind howled around her, but she didn't move, didn't run. Jake's heart raced as he studied her, her pale lilac skin and eyes wide with a mixture of terror and something else, something much darker. She was trembling, not only from the cold but from hunger. The child she held in her arms, a tiny, fragile thing barely hanging on to life, shifted slightly. It was clear. They were desperate. They were dying. Jake's breath caught in his throat as her gaze met his. There was fear. There was desperation, an unspoken plea for help. He could see the hunger in her eyes, and it twisted his gut. His own food supply was running dangerously low. There was barely enough for him to survive. The math was simple: help them or watch them die. Before he could make up his mind, something unexpected happened. Without a word, the woman stepped forward, shaking violently against the wind. Her lips barely moved as she whispered, "Please, we're starving." Her voice cracked like brittle ice. In that moment, Jake knew there was no other choice. His hand moved on its own, and he took off his pack, pulling out the last of his precious rations, a strange orange fruit he had found days before, one of the few things keeping him alive. His hand shook as he extended it to her. "Take it," he said softly. "It's all I have, but it's yours." She stared at the fruit, her eyes wide, her hand trembling as she reached for it. When her fingers closed around it, her entire body shook, and a sob escaped her as the tears froze on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you so much." Jake's heart clenched as he realized what this moment meant, not just for their survival, but for something far deeper. He wasn't just giving away food, he was offering them hope. The wind howled around them as Jake watched the woman clutch the fruit in her hands, her breath visible in the frigid air. Her tears froze on her cheeks, each drop a painful testament to their suffering. He felt something stir deep within him, something more than just pity. It was the weight of shared struggle. I can't remember the last time I had anything to eat," she said, her voice shaking, almost breaking. Her eyes, a deep shade of violet, searched Jake's face as if she couldn't quite believe his gesture. "Thank you, truly." Jake nodded, feeling the awkwardness of the moment settle between them. There were so many unspoken questions, so many things neither of them had said. Instead of speaking, he simply gestured to the path behind her. "You said you were heading somewhere?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, a place, a shelter. It's not far, it's warm." Jake glanced over his shoulder toward his own cabin, still a good distance away, but he had already made the decision. He couldn't leave her here. "Lead the way," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'll follow." The woman looked at him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but instead she simply nodded. She adjusted the bundle in her arms, pulling the small, emaciated child closer to her chest. Jake's eyes lingered on the baby, its tiny face so gaunt, so fragile. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their plight. "My name's Jake," he said, breaking the silence. She looked at him, her eyes a little softer now, though still filled with caution. "Mia," she replied, her voice hoarse. "And this is Leah," she added, nodding to the infant in her arms. The baby shifted slightly, its small hand reaching out, instinctively grabbing at the fruit. Mia smiled weakly. "She's barely had enough to even open her eyes these last few days." Jake gave a tight smile, his throat tightening at the thought of a child suffering this way. He couldn't help but feel the sting of guilt. He had enough food to last him a few more days, but it wasn't much. Yet somehow the moment seemed right to act. "It's not much," he said, his words more to himself than to Mia, "but we'll get through this." They began walking together, Jake keeping a careful eye on the horizon. The cold was unbearable, but Mia didn't seem to notice, her focus entirely on the small life she protected. The ground beneath them was treacherous, the snow deep and unforgiving, but Mia didn't slow down. She moved with an urgency, and Jake couldn't help but admire the strength she carried. As they walked, the silence between them was filled with the heavy weight of shared survival. The snow crunched under their feet, but nothing else could be heard except for the occasional soft murmur from Leah. Mia spoke again, her voice trembling from more than just the cold. "I didn't think anyone would be out here," she said, her eyes still scanning the horizon. "This place, it's supposed to be abandoned." Jake glanced at her, a frown forming. "I thought the same thing when I first arrived," he admitted. "But the cold doesn't care. It doesn't give you time to think about anything but survival." Mia nodded, her face hardening slightly. "I know. That's why I stayed. My team, they didn't make it. They tried to leave on an emergency shuttle when the war broke out on Lumira. The ship malfunctioned. They didn't survive the crash." She paused, her voice tight. "I should have gone with them, but I didn't. And now it's just me and Leah." Jake's heart sank as the weight of her words hit him. He could see the raw emotion in her eyes, guilt, regret, but also a fierce protectiveness that ran deeper than anything he could understand. "You did what you thought was best," he said quietly. "It's not easy, being alone." "I don't know how long I can keep doing it," Mia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could survive. I thought I could make it out here alone. But every day, it gets harder. And now, I have Leah to think about. I can't lose her too." Jake's gaze softened as he glanced at the baby, its small, fragile form wrapped up in layers of cloth. The truth was, Mia didn't need to say anything more. Her actions spoke louder than words. She wasn't just surviving, she was fighting, every minute of every day. And Jake had no doubt that if it were anyone else, they would have already given up. "Hey," he said, his voice more certain than he felt. "You won't lose her, not while I'm here." Mia looked at him, her eyes searching, as if trying to find the truth in his words. And for a brief moment, the wind didn't feel so cold. There was something unspoken between them now, a bond formed not from necessity alone, but from understanding. The kind of understanding that only comes when two people have nothing left but each other to rely on. They walked for what felt like hours, the snowstorm intensifying around them, but neither of them stopped. Jake's mind raced with questions. He had so many, but for now, there was only one thing he could focus on, getting them both to safety. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mia pointed ahead. "There. It's not much, but it's home." Jake looked up to see the outline of a small cabin just visible through the storm, a beacon of warmth in the midst of the endless white. He couldn't help the wave of relief that washed over him. They were close, closer than they'd ever been to safety. But as they neared the cabin, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that their troubles were far from over. Something about the look in Mia's eyes told him that the real battle was just beginning. The cabin loomed ahead, a small, weather-beaten structure barely visible through the thick snowfall. Jake felt the sharp sting of the wind in his face as they closed the distance. His body ached with exhaustion, the cold seeping deeper into his bones, but Mia's pace never slowed. She moved with the urgency of someone who had known too many close calls. As they reached the door, Mia pushed it open, the old wooden frame groaning in protest. Inside, the warmth hit them like a physical force, welcoming, comforting, but also a reminder of just how cold it had been outside. Jake immediately moved to the small stove in the corner, his hands trembling as he started to stoke the fire. Mia set Leah down on a pile of blankets by the hearth, the child barely stirring, her tiny body still pale from hunger. Mia knelt beside her, checking on her with a soft, worried expression. Jake watched her for a moment, a flicker of admiration and sorrow passing through him. He couldn't imagine what it must have been like to carry that weight, to survive in this place with nothing but the will to keep going. "You've been here long?" Jake asked, his voice low as he worked to get the fire going. Mia looked up at him, her gaze distant. "3 lunar cycles," she answered quietly, her fingers brushing through Leah's hair. 3 cycles of trying to make a life in a place that's barely alive. Jake paused for a moment, then nodded. "And you said you found something? Something that could help?" Mia's eyes met his, and she straightened up, looking toward the far corner of the cabin. "Yes, there's more than just survival here. There's something incredible hidden beneath the snow." Jake turned toward her, intrigued. "What do you mean? What's down there?" Mia stood, brushing the snow from her coat, her expression shifting from exhaustion to something else, curiosity, perhaps. "The crystal caves," she said. "I found them shortly after the crash. At first, I thought they were just some strange formation, but they're much more than that. They react to energy, to bioelectricity. They generate warmth, light. It's like they're alive in some way." Jake's interest peaked, his skepticism giving way to curiosity. "Alive?" he repeated. "You mean they're not just rocks?" Maya's lips quirked into a faint smile. "Exactly. They're not just rocks. I've been studying them. They're bioluminescent, but not in the way you'd expect. They interact with the environment, with the living. The longer I've been here, the more I've learned. They've kept me alive." Jake looked at her, his mind racing. "So you're saying these crystals, these rocks could help us?" She nodded. "They've been my only source of warmth, and if I'm right, they could do much more. They could power something, anything. Imagine an infinite source of energy right here. I think we're sitting on a gold mine." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "And you've been alone with this discovery? With no one else to help?" Mia's face tightened. "No one else, just me. And now, Leah." Jake turned away for a moment, the implications of her words sinking in. "And you're sure there's nothing dangerous about them?" "I've been careful," Mia said, her voice firm. "I haven't touched them too much, just enough to understand. They're delicate. I don't want to risk disrupting the ecosystem here." Jake frowned, still processing the information. "We should check it out, together." Mia hesitated. "It's not a place for strangers." "I'm not a stranger," Jake said, meeting her gaze. "I'm someone who's trying to survive just like you." Mia studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, we'll go. But we have to be careful. I don't know what else might be down there." Jake reached for his jacket, pulling it tighter around him. "Lead the way." The cave entrance was hidden beneath layers of snow and rock, a narrow fissure in the mountainside barely visible against the vast white landscape. Mia moved with purpose, the tracks of her boots already well worn in the snow. Jake followed closely, the air colder the higher they climbed. His breath came out in sharp clouds, and every step felt like a battle against the biting cold. As they neared the entrance, Jake could feel a strange energy in the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The ground beneath him hummed with a low vibration, like the planet itself was alive and pulsing. Mia stopped before the entrance, turning to him. "This is it," she said softly. "The entrance is narrow, but once we're inside, it opens up. And the crystals, they're unlike anything you've ever seen." Jake glanced at her, a mixture of excitement and caution in his eyes. "I've never seen anything like this, that's for sure." Mia smiled, her eyes gleaming with quiet pride. "Just wait, it's beautiful." They stepped into the fissure, the walls of rock encroaching on both sides. The further they went, the more the air shifted. The temperature grew warmer, the cold wind from outside fading away as if they had entered another world entirely. Then, as they rounded a corner, the full spectacle of the cave revealed itself. Jake gasped. The walls were alive with color. Bioluminescent crystals covered every surface, their light pulsing in sync with the vibrations of the ground beneath them. They weren't just glowing, they were moving, shifting with an energy that seemed almost alive. He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing against one of the larger crystals. The light intensified, flowing through the crystal like a ripple in water, a strange current running through his fingers. "This is incredible," Jake breathed, stepping deeper into the cave. Mia watched him, this a knowing look in her eyes. Told you. The deeper they ventured into the cave, the more Jake felt a connection to the crystals, almost as if they were responding to him. Each step seemed to amplify the feeling, the energy building as they moved forward. You see it, don't you? Mia asked, her voice barely a whisper in the cavernous space. It's not just light, it's something more. Jake nodded, his mind racing. This could change everything. As they ventured further, they could feel the atmosphere shifting around them, the crystals growing more intense. It was like stepping into the heart of the planet itself. Mia led him deeper, her excitement palpable. But as they pressed on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Something, or someone, was watching them in the depths of the crystal glow. The deeper they ventured into the crystal caves, the more the energy in the air seemed to resonate with Jake. It wasn't just the soft hum of the crystals beneath his fingertips. It was a presence, a sensation that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. The bioluminescent glow seemed to intensify, reacting to their movement, their very presence, as if the crystals were alive in some ancient way. Every step felt charged, as though they were crossing into the heart of something much larger than they could comprehend. Mia, walking beside him, seemed equally captivated, her eyes wide with wonder. It's not just energy, she murmured, her voice almost reverent. It's a connection between the crystals and everything around them. It's like the planet itself is conscious. Jake glanced over at her, curiosity flickering in his eyes. You mean the whole planet? Like, the crystals are a part of it? Part of the life here? Mia nodded, her expression thoughtful. Yes, it's as if the crystals are part of a larger network, almost like the planet's nervous system. And if I'm right, the connection is more than just physical, it's alive. The words hung in the air between them, weighty with their implications. Jake had always thought of planets as inert, just lifeless rocks spinning through space. But here, in the heart of Thera, he was starting to question everything he thought he knew. The air around them seemed alive with possibility. So, Jake said, his voice hushed as they continued walking, what does that mean for us? What does it mean for this, for survival? Mia paused, her hand hovering over one of the crystals. She traced a finger along its smooth surface, watching the light pulse brighter in response. I think it could mean everything, she said slowly. If we can understand it, harness it, we could have access to unlimited energy, power, maybe even the means to get off this planet. Jake turned to her, his eyes wide with realization. You're saying this could be a way out? It could be, Mia said, her voice growing more intense. But we don't know the full extent of the power here. I've been cautious, experimenting with what I've learned, but I don't know how much control we actually have. This place is ancient. These crystals, they've been here long before we arrived. Then why didn't you tell anyone about it? Jake asked, a hint of confusion in his voice. If it's that important, why keep it a secret? Mia's face softened, the weight of her isolation evident in the lines around her eyes. Because I didn't know who to trust. Because I didn't know if I could protect it, or if I should. Jake nodded, understanding now. The survival instinct had driven her to keep this discovery hidden, to protect it, just as she had protected Leah. But the more they spoke, the more he realized just how significant this place was, how it might change not just their lives, but the course of space exploration itself. They walked deeper into the cave, Jake now completely mesmerized by the beauty surrounding him. The walls shimmered with crystal formations that seemed to shift and sway, their light dancing in hypnotic patterns. The air felt warmer here, and despite the world outside being an unrelenting ice storm, there was a strange comfort in this underground sanctuary. Jake felt a shift between them, a subtle change in the way their bodies moved, in the way their eyes met. It was something beyond the science, beyond the survival instinct. They had been thrown together by the cruel hand of fate, but in this moment, surrounded by the hum of the living crystals, it felt as if they were meant to be here, together. He glanced at Mia, her eyes reflecting the iridescent glow of the crystals, and he felt the unspoken tension building. For all the danger and uncertainty, there was a deep connection between them, one that had grown from the need to survive and had slowly transformed into something more. This place, Jake murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. It feels different, like it's speaking to us. Mia smiled faintly, her gaze still focused on the crystals. Maybe it is. Maybe it's been waiting for someone to listen. Jake stepped closer to her, his heart racing. I don't know about you, but I've never been someone who believed in fate. But now, here with you, I'm starting to wonder. Mia turned to him, her expression soft but guarded. I don't know what I believe anymore. But I know this, we can't ignore what's happening here. These crystals, they're part of something bigger, something we can't yet understand. The cave seemed to grow warmer as they stood there, close enough that Jake could feel the heat radiating off of Mia's body. The air pulsed with an unseen force, and for a moment the world outside, the storm, the danger, the uncertainty, disappeared. It was just the two of them in this strange living place, and Jake could feel a magnetic pull drawing him closer to her. Mia noticed his proximity, her breath catching for a moment. Jake? What are we doing? He reached out slowly, as if drawn by something deeper than simple attraction. I don't know, but I do know this. I can't keep pretending like everything's normal. Not anymore. The moment hung in the air, fragile as the crystals around them. And then, without thinking, Jake leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, soft and tentative at first, but quickly growing more urgent as the connection between them deepened. It was a kiss born not out of lust, but out of shared understanding, of survival, of vulnerability, of something unspoken that had been building between them since that first moment they met in the snow. When they pulled away, their foreheads touched, both of them breathing hard, but neither of them willing to break the connection. Mia spoke softly, her voice trembling. We're not just surviving anymore, are we? No, Jake whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We're living. The cave seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy as Jake and Mia stood close, the warmth of their shared moment still lingering between them. But as the crystal light flickered around them, Jake's heart suddenly raced for another reason. Something was wrong. The peaceful silence of the caves felt fragile, as though the air itself was waiting for something to break it. And then it came. A low rumble reverberated through the walls, a tremor that started at their feet and spread up through their bodies. Jake's gaze snapped to Mia's face, her eyes wide in alarm. It wasn't the cave shifting. It wasn't an aftershock. It was something else, something far more sinister. Mia looked toward the entrance of the cave, her expression clouded with fear. They're coming, she whispered, her voice tight with dread. The Aurora Force. They've detected the energy signature. Jake's stomach twisted. The Aurora Force. The very faction that had torn apart Mia's homeworld. The faction that had chased her to this godforsaken planet. The thought of them arriving here, drawn by the same energy that had kept Mia and Leah alive, made his blood run cold. How do you know? Jake asked, his voice low, tense. I've seen their ships before, Mia said, her words clipped as she stepped away from him, her eyes scanning the cave's entrance. They've been searching for new resources, new weapons, and now they found it. The weight of her words hung between them like a thick fog. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This wasn't just about the crystals. The Aurora Force was coming for something much bigger, something far more dangerous. If they found the caves, if they discovered what Mia and Jake had uncovered, it could mean disaster. Mia's face hardened with resolve, but there was something else there too. Fear. Not for herself, but for Leah, for the life she was trying so desperately to protect. We need to get out of here, Jake said, his mind racing. Now. Mia nodded, her lips tight. She reached down, scooping Leah up from the pile of blankets, holding the child against her chest, as if the simple act could somehow shield her from the storm of danger that was rapidly approaching. But as Jake turned to move, a sudden, sharp sound broke the silence, a distant metallic groan, followed by the unmistakable whir of engines. They're here, Mia whispered, her voice trembling now with more than just fear. The harsh reality of their situation had arrived. The Aurora Force had made their way to Thera faster than Jake had ever expected. Without another word, Mia started toward the exit, her steps quick but measured. Jake followed closely, his mind spinning with the implications of their next move. If the Aurora Force was really here, they didn't have much time. They couldn't afford to fight them, at least not yet. They needed to outsmart them. They needed to stay one step ahead. As they emerged from the cave's entrance, the howling winds greeted them like a slap to the face. The blizzard outside had only intensified, the world around them now a swirling mass of snow and ice. The distant rumble of engines became clearer, more menacing, as Jake looked toward the horizon. "Mia, what now?" Jake asked, his breath coming in short gasps as he tried to keep up with her. His heart pounded in his chest, the urgency of the situation beginning to settle in his mind. "There's a small research station to the north," Mia said, her voice grim. "It's a long shot, but we might be able to use the equipment there to send a distress signal or sabotage their systems. If we're lucky, we might be able to buy enough time for us to get away." Jake's heart sank. He knew the station well. It was part of the outpost he'd crashed near, but it had been abandoned for years. There was no guarantee that the equipment still worked or that they could make it there without being detected. "Let's move," Jake said, his voice firm. "We don't have a choice." They began to move swiftly, their bodies pressed low against the biting wind. The snow was deep, and every step felt like a battle against the elements. The sounds of the Aurora Force's ship were getting louder, and Jake could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. They were close. Too close. Mia glanced at him, her expression a mix of fear and determination. "Jake, if they find us." "They won't," Jake interrupted, cutting her off. He didn't know how he was going to make that true, but he refused to let fear take over. Not now. Not when they were so close. "We'll stay ahead. We'll make sure of it." The tension between them had shifted. There was no longer any room for doubt. Whatever happened, they were in this together. He knew it in his bones now, and Mia knew it too. As they neared the research station, Jake's thoughts raced. They needed to act fast, but they also needed to think clearly. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting the discovery they had made, the one that could change everything. The crystals, the power beneath their feet, it was too valuable to fall into the wrong hands. And the Aurora Force, they were definitely the wrong hands. Suddenly, the wind howled louder, almost as if the planet itself was warning them of what was to come. Mia's pace quickened, her eyes scanning the horizon, the station just a few hundred meters away now. "We're almost there," she murmured, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and dread. "We can do this." Jake could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but his resolve had never been clearer. As long as he was with Mia, as long as Leah was safe, he was going to make sure they did what they had to do. They reached the station's perimeter, their breaths coming in sharp bursts as they ducked behind a row of broken machinery, the towering structure barely visible through the blinding snow. Maya quickly dropped to a crouch, checking her surroundings. "We need to get inside before they spot us," she whispered urgently, her face set in determination. "There's a small access hatch on the far side." Jake nodded, his pulse quickening. He could feel the pressure mounting, the danger closing in. The Aurora Force was here, and if they didn't move fast, everything they had worked for, the survival, the connection, the hope, would be lost. The blizzard raged outside as Jake and Mia crouched behind the shattered machinery near the research station, their breath visible in the freezing air, their hearts pounding in unison. Every gust of wind carried with it the sound of approaching engines, loud, mechanical, and menacing. The Aurora Force was closer now, their ship cutting through the snowstorm like a predator tracking its prey. It wasn't just their footsteps they had to worry about anymore. It was the relentless pursuit of something far greater than them. The crystals, the energy beneath Thera's surface, were too important to fall into the wrong hands. Mia turned to Jake, her face set with determination, but her eyes betrayed the weight of the decision before them. "Once we're inside, we'll need to act fast," she whispered, her voice urgent. "The equipment here, it's outdated, but it might still give us a chance to send a message. If we can reach someone, if we can warn them, we'll have a fighting chance." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. "We can't wait for a ship to pick us up," he said, his tone tight with resolve. "We need to disable their systems, or we risk them getting what they want. The last thing we need is them mining the planet for more of these crystals." Mia clenched her jaw, her grip on Leah tightening. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said firmly. "But I need you with me. You're the only one who can help get past their defenses." He gave a brief, strained smile. I'm not backing down now. Not after everything we've seen. Not after everything we've been through. Together, they moved swiftly, crouching low as they dashed toward the side of the station, the wind howling louder than ever, masking their movements. The distant roar of the Aurora Force's ship was deafening now, the low thrumming of its engines vibrating through the snow and the ground beneath their feet. They reached the access hatch, its rusted surface barely holding against the brutal cold. Mia worked quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she inserted a makeshift key into the hatch's locking mechanism. "It's old," she muttered, glancing at Jake, "but it should still open." She turned the key with a sharp twist, and the hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow, dark passage leading into the heart of the station. Inside, the air was stale, but warm compared to the freezing world outside. The station had been abandoned for years, but there was still power running through its old circuits. A low hum buzzed in the air, faint lights flickering on as they stepped inside. The feeling of something ancient, something forgotten, crept over Jake. The place was a relic, a piece of history, and now it was their only chance at survival. They moved quickly through the dimly lit corridors, Mia leading the way with determination, while Jake kept an eye on their surroundings. The station's layout was familiar to him. He had seen it briefly when he had first crash-landed, but back then, it had been a lifeless ruin. Now it felt like it was alive again, its walls echoing with the footsteps of those who had once used it. Mia stopped suddenly, her eyes locking onto a terminal in the far corner of the room. "There," she whispered. "That's our best bet." They rushed over to the terminal, and Mia immediately began to work on the outdated keyboard, her fingers flying across the keys with practiced precision. "We need to send out a signal," she muttered, her voice tense. "I've got a distress code that should reach anyone in the area, but it's going to take a few minutes to rewire this system." Jake glanced nervously over his shoulder. The sound of the Aurora Force's ship was unmistakable now. It was circling overhead, the hum of its engines growing louder by the second. He knew they didn't have much time. The pressure was building, and he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Mia, we need to hurry." "I'm going as fast as I can," she snapped, her eyes flicking between the terminal and the entrance. "But if we don't disable their systems, they'll just track us. We'll be sitting ducks. I need to reroute their navigation." Suddenly, the low hum of the station shifted. Jake's breath caught in his throat as a distant, mechanical screech echoed from above. The station's exterior doors, one of the last defenses, were beginning to open. They were running out of time. "Mia," Jake said urgently, "they're coming. We need to finish this now." Mia's hands flew faster, her brow furrowed with concentration. The dim lights of the terminal flickered as the old system hummed under her commands. "I've almost got it," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "Once I finish rerouting the nav systems, we'll be able to send out a false signal, one that will make them think we've gone in the opposite direction." Jake turned, watching the shadows grow darker as the door began to creak open fully. "We've got seconds," he said, his voice strained. "We can't let them find us, not like this." Mia's fingers hesitated for just a moment, her mind racing, before she hit the final key. The terminal hummed, and the screen flickered as the data transferred. A soft beep sounded, and Mia let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "It's done," she said quietly. "We're sending a false signal. They'll think we're heading south, away from the crystals." Jake didn't waste a second. He grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her toward the back exit. "Let's go. We don't have much time." The two of them moved quickly, the door closing behind them with a heavy metallic thud. They darted through the back alleys of the station, the wind howling in their ears as they ducked out of sight. Behind them, the faint sound of the Aurora Force's ship growing fainter. It was working. They had done it. But as they reached the edge of the station, their relief was short-lived. The ground beneath them shook with an intensity that sent them stumbling, and a loud explosion erupted nearby, sending debris flying into the air. The station's exterior had been breached. The Aurora Force was on the move. "Mia, they're here!" Jake shouted, adrenaline pumping through his veins. Mia's face went pale as she realized what had just happened. "They're not falling for it." Jake pulled her close. "We're not running anymore," he said, his voice hard. "We fight, we hold our ground, we protect what we found." The fight had only just begun. The explosion reverberated through the ground beneath them, sending a shockwave of panic rushing through Jake and Mia. Dust and debris filled the air, blinding them for a moment. They stumbled, eyes wide with the realization that there was no more running, no more hiding. The Aurora Force had found them. The game had changed. Mia's grip on Leah tightened as she turned to Jake, her face a mask of resolve. "We hold our ground, Jake. We have to. If we let them take us, everything we've worked for, everything you've helped me protect, it's all gone." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning their surroundings. They were in the open now, no cover, no place to run. The enemy was too close, the danger too real. He could hear the telltale hum of the Aurora Force's ship descending, its shadow darkening the snow-covered ground. But then, out of the corner of his eye, something caught his attention. A faint, distant glow. It was coming from the direction of the crystal caves. "Mia," Jake said, his voice urgent. "Look, the crystals. They're reacting." Mia's gaze followed his, and her breath caught in her throat as she saw what Jake was seeing. The crystal formations, once passive, now pulsed with an intense, brilliant light, casting long shadows across the desolate landscape. It was like the planet itself was awakening, responding to something deep within the earth. The air around them seemed to vibrate with power, and for the first time since their crash, Jake felt something other than fear. There was a force in these crystals, something ancient, something alive. This is it," Mia whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "The crystals, they're alive. They're reacting to us, to what we've done. They're calling to us." Jake's heart raced as he looked back at her, the weight of their situation suddenly shifting. The Aurora Force was still coming, but now there was something else in the air, a sense of urgency, of destiny. The crystals, those strange alien structures they had barely begun to understand, were more than just a power source. They were alive, and they had chosen their side. "We have to go," Jake said, his voice firm. "We can't fight them like this, but we don't need to fight them. We need to get to the crystals. We need to tap into their power." Mia's eyes sparkled with the same realization. She nodded, her expression fierce with determination. "I've studied them. I've learned enough. We can use the energy. We can fight back. But we need to get to the heart of the cave. That's where it all begins." The ground shook again, the ship's engines roaring louder as it came closer, but Mia and Jake didn't flinch. They had no choice now. There was no running. The only option was to harness the very thing they had discovered, the power of the crystals themselves. With one last look toward the research station, where the shadow of the Aurora Force loomed, they turned and sprinted toward the glowing light in the distance. Their legs burned with effort, but their determination carried them forward. As they approached the entrance to the crystal caves, the world around them seemed to fall away. The energy pulsing from the crystals surged, surrounding them, enveloping them in its warmth. The walls shimmered, as if welcoming them home. The air was thick with an almost tangible force, and Jake could feel the power coursing through him, an electric current running through his veins. He glanced at Mia, who was breathing heavily beside him, her face illuminated by the kaleidoscope of colors radiating from the crystals. "This is it," Mia said, her voice awestruck but resolute. "This is our chance." They stepped deeper into the cave, the hum of the crystals growing louder, hip as though the entire planet was breathing with them. But then, as they reached the heart of the cave, a sudden, sharp sound cut through the air, a crackling static, followed by a distorted voice. "This is Commander Rax of the Aurora Force. We have you surrounded. Surrender now, and we will spare your lives. Fight, and we will eliminate you." The voice echoed through the cave, but it didn't have the same weight it once would have. In the presence of the crystals, the message felt distant, insignificant. Jake's gaze locked onto Mia's, their faces illuminated by the glowing crystals, their resolve clear. "No turning back," Jake said quietly. Mia's lips curled into a defiant smile. "No turning back." And just as the Aurora Force prepared to descend upon them, the ground beneath them shook violently, the crystal formations around them glowing brighter and brighter, their energy reaching its peak. The air crackled with power, and for a moment, everything stopped. Time seemed to freeze. Then, with a brilliant flash, the world around them erupted in light. The ground trembled as the power of the crystals surged, sending a shockwave through the planet. The Aurora Force's ship faltered, the transmission cutting out. The very atmosphere seemed to pulse with energy, as though the planet had awakened, and it wasn't about to let invaders claim what was its own. Jake and Mia stood at the center of the cave, the light from the crystals flooding over them, casting long, sharp shadows. They didn't know what would happen next. They didn't know if the Aurora Force would retreat or if the crystals would destroy everything in their path. What they did know was this: they had tapped into something far beyond their understanding, something that could change the future of humanity, of space exploration, and of Thera itself. But the outcome was uncertain. The crystals had only just begun to reveal their power, and as the light blazed around them, everything faded to white.